That was a unique leader. You may not know this about Pastor Paul, but he was in marching band, and he was doing his marching band walk there. Okay, so give him a bit of a hard time about that. Walking is a unique milestone for humans. Did you know this? You see, most animals, most mammals, they learn to walk right away or very soon after birth. You've seen those videos of like the giraffe who's just born and is trying to stand up, or like little cats who are trying to move their way along, right? Other animals can walk right after birth, but humans, they can't. Humans are different. Humans develop walking skills much later. They have had, and actually have had to undergo certain developmental milestones before they start walking. They have to roll and they have to scoot and they have to pull themselves up to standing, and then they are supported in their walking by holding on to someone or something before they ever take their first steps on their own. For humans, walking happens as a part of developmental progression. Our own 6-month-old, who's nice and loud over there, is not yet walking, but you can tell that she is getting ready to walk. She is very interested in keeping up with us. She's rolling around and she's rocking on her hands and knees. There's something innately within her that desires to get up and to move along like the rest of us. There is something in our humanity, in our being created in the image of God, that desires to get up off the ground and walk. And if it's true in our bodies and our genetic makeup and the way that we are, it could also then be true for our spirituality. So today we begin a series, as you heard, on following Jesus together. We have these fancy shirts. You, too, can have one of these fancy shirts. And it's a series, and it's a word, it's maybe even a mission statement, not that we're just slapping on a shirt or slapping on a wall or putting on a mug, but because we want this to be a part of our lives, and we want it to be a part of who we are. And so as we are following Jesus together, we are looking at the Gospel of Mark. And Mark, as a gospel, as a book, has some particularities. And before we kind of jump into the text for today, I want to talk a little bit about the book of Mark, all right? So in the Bible, some of you may know this, but it's always good to get a refresher. In the Bible, there are 4 gospel books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those 4 gospel books tell the story of Jesus, the good news of Jesus, which we call the gospel, which is why we call them the 4 gospels. Now, Mark is the second of those, in our Bibles, is the second of those 4 books. And Mark is the shortest one, okay? We didn't pick Mark because Mark is the shortest one. It just happened to be that way. Mark, as a book, is short not because he leaves, the author leaves anything out, but because he goes quickly. Mark is often nicknamed the pedestrian gospel because everything happens really, really fast. 1 minute you're here and the next minute you're there. In fact, Mark has the word immediately 41 times in its book. Of all the Gospels, of all the 4 that have been written, Mark was actually written closest to the lifetime of Jesus. And then therefore was, the other Gospel writers used that, they used Mark to help write their own Gospel book. The writer, we can imagine, we actually don't know if his name was Mark, all right? That's just a guess because a lot of people were named Mark back in those days because the author never signs it by Mark. We just guess his name is Mark. They don't think that Mark was very educated. Mark was just a regular guy. And we know that because he doesn't use fancy language or very unique styles of communication that were common when you would write letters back in those days or when you would write a book in those days. But this Mark, had something to say. And this Mark doesn't beat around the bush with it. He moves with it. the pedestrian gospel. One of the key themes in this book is that Jesus is a great companion. And that Jesus not only is a companion that will walk with those he is with, but that Jesus is a companion in suffering. And that Jesus decided to enter into suffering so that we would not be alone. If you are taking notes and you want to write down some things, that would be a really interesting thing to write down and to hold in front of you for the next couple months. So Mark is on the move with Jesus. And while Mark has no mention of Jesus' birth, we don't get that in his book. We don't even get the lineage like we get in the other ones. We don't get the backstory of Jesus. We just are all of a sudden, Jesus is ministering. And right as Jesus is beginning his ministry, Jesus starts calling people to himself. And that is where we land in our text this morning. This is Mark chapter 1. I love a good chapter 1. And I would invite you, if you have a Bible in front of you or with you or next to you or on your phone, take it out, look at it with me. If you don't or you prefer the screens, I welcome you to take a look at those screens. But we will be reading Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20. It says this: as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen, better than clowns. Jesus says, verse 17, "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once, they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, another word for immediately, without delay he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired man and followed him. God's word for God's people. Thanks be to God. Because Mark moves so quickly through the story, we don't actually have a lot of context to understand what Simon or Andrew or James or John are thinking or experiencing before they have this encounter with Jesus on the side of the lake. But I would venture to guess that there is something going on underneath the surface of their lives that made them then rise up and act when Jesus calls them. These under-the-surface things are very significant in our life with Jesus. Oftentimes, those under-the-surface things feel like longings or dissatisfactions or uneasiness, and they pester us. And when they pester us, we can become very quick to start finding solutions to satiate the discomfort. We're always looking then to fix the problem. But those things that may agitate us, may be inviting us to consider that a calling is coming. It's not natural to consider that we might be dissatisfied or uneasy or longing for something because God is preparing our soul to get up and move with Jesus. But that's perhaps what's happening here. This is perhaps what's happening in our own human walking development. Babies become quite dissatisfied with the rolling around and then the crawling and being close to the ground. There's like something in them and within each of us, because we were all babies too once, okay? There is something within us that then desires to get up and move with our feet. It's God's design at work in our bodies, in our development, and I would argue it is God's design in the work of our souls. So when Jesus encounters these fishermen, people he's never met before, and he says, "Come, follow me," it must have stirred something deep with inside Simon and Andrew and James and John. Just even those 3 words would have resounded against the walls of their being in such a way that their whole lives became attentive to what was being invited. Simon, Andrew, James, and John didn't have a definition for discipleship. They had no idea who they were following or what that following would mean. They didn't know, actually, that their response to Jesus in this very moment right there on the side of the Sea of Galilee was actually becoming the definition of discipleship. They just did what they thought they should do based on their dissatisfactions and their uneasiness and the sound of a call that reverberated in their souls. They just responded. And eventually, over the course of their whole lifetime, they lived the definition of discipleship. You're going to hear a lot of definitions of discipleship in this series. And the reason why I don't ever want to give you one is because discipleship is as individual as the image of God within us. And discipleship requires not just one to disciple, but a together to disciple. And so we're going to hear multiple definitions, all of them hopefully to serve you. If we were to look at Simon and Andrew and James and John and their definition of discipleship as lived out in their lives, it is this. It's 3 things. To receive Jesus' call, to physically follow him, feet, they used their feet, and risking the suffering that may endure. At the start of our series in Mark, I'd like to invite us to consider our discipleship with some freshness. Perhaps you've been following Jesus for a very long time, or perhaps following Jesus is a new thing for you. But either way, I would like us to embrace the freshness of it. There may be things that we need to unlearn that we have attached to our discipleship, things that may not belong. There may be ways of our discipleship forming that actually need to be reformed or redeemed. If I were to become like the littlest child in my discipleship, a child who is learning to walk again, I wonder what Jesus I would encounter. I wonder if we would become like little children again and learn to walk again with Jesus. Because if Jesus approached you in the near future, maybe even right now, in the midst of your very life, with all of your particular longings and dissatisfactions and uneasinesses, that's a word I made up, I wonder how his voice, I wonder how his words, I wonder how his invitation would sound to you. Come, follow me. Come, Venkat, follow me. Come, Katie, follow me. Come, Jim, follow me. Come, Gary. Come, Janet. Come, Nathan. Come, Britta, follow me. Jesus' invitation doesn't then just settle with followership. Come, Andrew, Simon, James, John, just follow me. That wasn't the end of it. And Jesus isn't only just interested in followership, right? He's not an influencer on TikTok looking for people to influence, to buy the things that he's trying to sell. Jesus says, come, follow me. And I'm going to cut this phrase in half. And I will make you. Pause right there. And I will make you. Jesus will make you. Discipleship. Here comes another definition. Discipleship is the stunning resignation of our wills to God's transforming work in our lives. Jesus is the one who makes disciples. Jesus does the work of transformation in each individual's life. This might actually be fresh news for those of us who have been at it a while. Spiritual transformation, spiritual formation is God's responsibility. It is not our responsibility. But we do have a responsibility. And our responsibility is to open ourselves to the work of God. That's it. Housed in the first 8 English words, come follow me and I will make you. It's actually 7 Greek words. But housed in those words of their calling of discipleship, Simon, Andrew, James, and John hear that they are not in charge of their transformation. Not come follow me and do all this work because you're lowly and pathetic and you really have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work hard so that you might be changed. Whew, that would be a lot for Jesus to say right there on the side of the lake. No, come follow me and I will make you. Their hard work, their study, their attendance, their acts of justice, their giving of money, or saying nice things to the guy who cuts them off in traffic. Maybe it's chariot traffic, we don't know. Or the worship songs that they're singing. None of these things will cause their transformation as a disciple of Jesus. From Christian discipleship's infancy, Jesus has been in charge of transformation. Jesus says, I will make you. And what's lost in the English translation is a very powerful verb. In Greek, it's ginomai, all right? It hurts a little to say. Ginomai, which means become. Literally, it sounds like this: I will make you become. It's like a caring adult who helps a baby become a walker. That adult walks alongside that little one, holds their hands as they gain balance. That adult helps them back up when the baby falls down so they might try again. And then little by little, in these arms of grace, a baby becomes a walker. I think this is part of our becoming a disciple of Jesus. Because walking with Jesus requires us to hold on to Jesus. To gain spiritual equilibrium, if you will. That we then might experience the very reliable grace that reaches down and gently pulls us up when we've fallen down. So that we might then stand up and try to step one more time. It's in this way, holding on, experiencing it for ourselves, falling over and being held up in grace, that we become disciples of Jesus. I don't know about you, but I can't help but think of that modern and perhaps quite tired parable, the footprints in the sand. Have you heard this one? Have you seen it? Is it on your walls? You know what I'm talking about. It's this parable where the storyteller says that Jesus is walking with us on the beach, right? And when it seems that there's only, usually there are 2 sets of footprints, Jesus' footprints and ours, yeah? And then when it seems like there's only 1 set of footprints, there are sometimes in the very hard and achy times of our lives, this parable says it's not as though Jesus left you, but it was that Jesus was carrying you, and so therefore you only have 1 set of footprints in the sand. Or actually my favorite rendition of the same illustration where there are footprints in the sand and then a deep rut in the sand alongside the footprints, and the person asks, why is there this deep rut there? And Jesus says, well, that's where I dragged you along. Which I love. It came up in the children's sermon. You would drag us. I think they know about this footprints in the sand. I don't think following Jesus and this footprint in the sand parable match. I think the parable falls just a little bit short because in both instances, it fails to acknowledge our becoming, our being made in the likeness of Christ as we walk. And it's not as though Jesus is like, all right, if things are going to be hard, I'm just going to haul you over my shoulder and walk you through it. But Jesus actually comes up next to, maybe the footprints are closer together. And Jesus says, let me hold you along. You're going to keep stepping, but it's going to take some time. Maybe there's another print in the sand where we may have fallen down. And it's not as though Jesus then drags us along. You get sand burns and stuff like that. No, Jesus says, I'll help you stand up. Come a little bit closer. Let's walk together. Walking with Jesus as our companion, which is the theme of Mark, is the source of our transformation as disciples. In recent years, I've borrowed a prayer from Ruth Haley Barton, and it goes something like this. If there is anything that needs to be done with me and within me, you will have to do it, God. If there's anything that needs to be done with me or within me, you will have to do it, God. And it's taken me a long while to come to this kind of prayer, a prayer that feels like stunning resignation to the will of God's transforming work. And let there be no mistake, I don't often get to this place willingly. Oh, God, if there's anything that you need to do, you'll have to do it. Oftentimes there's some kicking and some screaming and some tears and some words. And I have been surprised, very surprised, what becomes of me by the time I even get to that prayer. And then I'm surprised by what happens in response. It's not that the situation changes, it's that I change. It's not that even my perspective changes. It's that I'm seeing things then through Jesus. I invite you to pray a prayer like that. If there is anything that needs to be done with me and within me, you will have to do it, God. Come, follow me, Jesus says, and I will make you become, and then this random phrase, for us at least, fishers of people. Now, I have to be honest. I am no fisherwoman, all right? The phrase, you be fishers of people, it doesn't pull on my heartstrings. All I can think about is like slipperiness, being cold, and guts, all right? Not very interested in that. But in closer study, it makes a lot of sense, of course, to Simon and Andrew and James and John. And it actually does have a very important thing for us, a valuable call for us in our discipleship. Because certainly Jesus is giving Simon, Andrew, James, and John a vision for their particular life. But Jesus is also giving you and me a vision for our particular life as well. Jesus is certainly transforming these fishermen's vocation from literally fishing with the fish to fishing for people with the people. But we don't always understand why. I wonder, what does the work of fishing tell us about discipleship? I read in a commentary that fishing is fatal. I knew that already, all right, but it was helpful to read it in this commentary. Fishing is fatal. The goal of fishing is death for the fish, obviously, not for you, unless you're on one of those crazy TV shows with the salmon and the sharks. Anyway, fishing is fatal. See, when a fisher person hooks a fish, there are fatal consequences for the fish. Life does not go on as it did before for the fish, and for the person too. With Jesus, your life cannot go on as before. When you are caught with Jesus, your life cannot go on as before. And this points to something very significant in our journey of discipleship. Because the trajectory of discipleship is movement toward the cross. The trajectory of following Jesus together is not immediate joy and life and delight. It's actually dying to self. It is actually experiencing intimate experiences of suffering. It is actually aching for hope when all seems hopeless. One commentator put it this way: those who are caught in discipleship of Jesus will come to great joy, but only on the other side of suffering. Discipleship is always moving towards the cross. And we cannot ignore where we are headed. In some ways, we can't even prepare for it. All right, I'm going to gird my loins for this hard work of suffering. It's actually that when we do find ourselves in times of suffering, in seasons of suffering, in a lifetime of suffering, we find a Jesus who knows it. There may be experiences for you, past, present, future, where your suffering might take the life out of you. When your suffering alters the way you live and breathe and think and know and walk. And when your suffering, not if, when your suffering sounds and feels like that, what you will find is a Jesus that suffers with you. That the ultimate fisherman of people would lovingly will themselves, would lovingly will himself to be caught for our sakes, lovingly willed to be on the hook, if you will. Not only to take our place, but to actually prove that in our deepest suffering, even in our death, we have a companion that is with us. Jesus says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of people." I'll be on the hook. The text continues. At once they left their nets and they followed Jesus. At once. This is common for the book of Mark, but really, these gentlemen, at once, they leave their nets. It's as though they released their attachment to all the things that made up their life and literally started walking with Jesus. At the sound of an invitation, something within their dissatisfaction or longings or uneasiness is met by the clarity of calling, and they go. And I imagine the people around them, it says that Father Zebedee is just like, oh, when they start walking away. Probably offended, maybe astounded, maybe a little frustrated. Like, how dare they just leave me literally in a boat? They just leave their dad in a boat. How dare they? It made no sense. It made no earthly sense. But it did make divine sense. They were doing exactly as God had created them. They started walking. They just started walking. And they were free from the attachment to things that they thought that they needed. And they were wholly then held up. Wholly, not just holy, but completely held up by God in the flesh. They walked with Jesus. As we open this series on discipleship, it is very appropriate that we would begin opening ourselves to the transforming work of God in us. And the best way that I know how to do this is with that one-line prayer, but also through an ancient spiritual practice called welcoming prayer. We've done it before a little bit here, but I always welcome a reminder. And so our welcoming prayer sounds like this. It sounds like this. But I invite you to make it your own. When we pray the welcoming prayer, we pray to God, I release my attachment for safety and security, for power and control, for esteem and affection. I release my attachment to these things. I release the need to make these things my gods. And I choose to follow you. And so it is my prayer, and we are going to pray this welcoming prayer together. It is my prayer that this opportunity would free us and free our souls to be available to God's transforming work in our life. I pray it frees us to walk with Jesus and then to find friends along the way who are also walking with Jesus. I pray that it would be the start, that it would be the stand for us to stand up in our discipleship and then follow Jesus together. So would you pray this prayer with me? Jesus, you said, come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of people. And we confess that we are attached to things that are not you. We have attached ourselves to things that don't allow for your transforming work in our lives. So as we prepare to walk with you, perhaps in a new way for the first time, I pray you release us from our attachment to safety and security. I pray you release us from our attachment to power and control. I pray you release us from our attachment to esteem and affection. So God, that as we walk with you, we might find the sum and the fullness of these things with our Savior Jesus. So that we might be reminded that we're not only never alone, but that we are constantly being changed. And so we open ourselves to you, we avail ourselves to your Spirit.